Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the 3 LEQs that were on the paper version of the 2021 AP US History exam. If you are looking for a reaction and breakdown for the DBQ and SAQs, those videos are already posted. Note, if you are taking the online version of the exam, these LEQs will not be on there. And actually, there is no LEQ for online test takers. So I had a couple of reactions when I first saw these 3 prompts. First, I thought it was interesting to have a prompt that completely resided in period 1, as that time period is usually only covered minimally on the exam, with a multiple choice question set or maybe an SAQ. The next thing I thought was that 2 out of the 3 prompts were on the easier side, and there was one, if I were taking the test, that I would have avoided. So the 2 easier prompts I think are number 1 and number 3. And I actually think I would have chosen number 1. Evaluate the extent to which transatlantic voyages in the period 1491 to 1607 affected the Americas. The reason I would have chosen this one is because I think all phases of writing an LEQ, including the context, thesis, and evidence, are pretty easy to come up with for this prompt. So that leads us to the next part of this video, which is breaking down the prompts and what would work for context and evidence for each of them. Okay, so looking at the first prompt, there is a lot of potential evidence and topics for the context. Now, you would not need all of these, but a few of them with explanations would be enough to get the point. So this would include discussing the sailing technologies developed in the 1400s that made transatlantic voyages possible, the completion of Spanish Reconquista and the union of Ferdinand and Isabella, creating a powerhouse on the coast of the Atlantic that was able to fund voyages of exploration and conquest. Of course, the reasons for exploration in the 3 Gs, God, gold, and glory, and then also touching upon what is going on in the Americas, with empires like the Inca and the Aztecs, and how geography and climate had a huge influence on Native American culture and lifestyles. As for acceptable evidence, there is a plethora to choose from, including disease, especially smallpox, wiping out a huge percentage of Native Americans, the destruction of Native cultures and societies by Spanish and Portuguese conquest, the impacts of the triangular trade, specifically the Middle Passage, and forcibly transporting enslaved Africans to replace the Native American labor in the production of cash crops. And some of these other items include the Treaty of Tordesillas, which splits up zones of influence between the Portuguese and the Spanish, with the Portuguese getting the coast of Brazil and the Spanish getting the rest of the Americas, and the other Western European powers like the Dutch, the French, and the British playing catch-up to the Spanish, with British pirates like Drake harassing Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. So the second prompt is the one I would have steered clear of, not because of the time period and topic, but because of the way the prompt is worded. You have a couple of variables to contend with. First, you have to identify the reform activities, like the beginning of the women's suffrage movement, abolitionist movement, public education, etc. But then you need to focus on what caused these activities. So things like the Second Great Awakening, ideas from the American Revolution, the expansion of slavery with the growth of cotton, the era of the common man, and to a lesser extent, but still relevant, the market revolution. And you have to argue their relative importance to the reform activities mentioned before. So kind of difficult. Plus, I think the context and evidence overlap in a lot of areas as well. All right, the last prompt. Evaluate the extent to which international conflicts in the period 1898 to 1930 affected the role of the United States in the world. For context on this one, I think it makes sense to discuss how the time period of the prompt is a change from the previous era when the U.S. was more inward focused with events like the Civil War and Reconstruction and the wars in the plains that resulted with the end of the frontier, which then the U.S. begins to look more outward at the rest of the world in the time period of the prompt. Also, how the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s turned the U.S. into a major economic power, and it was ready to turn that economic power into global influence. There could definitely be other evidence as well for context. But now turning to acceptable evidence in the body paragraphs, there are a variety of things a writer could talk about. They would definitely want to include something about imperialism, including specific events like the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, the Panama Canal, or the idea of white man's burden. Also, reasons why the U.S. got engaged in World War I, including the issues it had with German submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegrams. Any essay would have been on solid ground if it discussed one or more of these foreign policy stances, including Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, or Wilson's moral diplomacy. The League of Nations could have been used to show nuance as well, as much of the world signed on to Wilson's idea for an international government, but not its own country, as the U.S. feared losing its sovereignty. And then there's the 1920s, which my guess, if students brought it up, they may have discussed it as an era of isolationism. However, there are examples of the U.S. as acting as a global leader with the Washington Naval Conference, which was an attempt to limit naval armaments, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which the U.S. got many other nations to sign on to an agreement to renounce war and violent conflict as a means to solving disputes. And all this stems from the conflict of World War I. Okay, so that does it for the LEQ prompts. If you have some evidence, thesis, or context you're curious about with any of these prompts, write it in the comments section below, and I'll give you my thoughts on whether or not it would have worked for points.